Well, first of all, this is a peculiar kind of war in which there was not really a great prosecution of the war. How different it was from World War II. What characterized this war, and here America must be very much credited, was restraint. Here we are, one of the great powers of the world. We take on an insignificant power. As far as explosiveness and so forth is concerned, we had far more than the enemy. Maybe the greatness of a man is often to be judged by his restraint of power. That was the great wonder of Christ, that having divine power, he used so little of it. And so America shows and has shown great restraint in this war.
Well, but is it always commendable to use restraint? Or is restraint sometimes an expression of cowardice or lack of conviction?
It can be both. First of all, one may not show restraint in order to absorb evil. Take, for example, turning the other cheek. If there are 10 men in a line, and I preach hate to them, and say, you must destroy your brother, and the one man turns and strikes his neighbor, 2 strikes 3, when will it ever stop? It will stop only at a point when one man turns around and absorbs the evil. In that sense, restraint can absorb evil. From another point of view, restraint does not absorb evil. It sometimes may increase it. The crime certainly on our streets today, the turn of law by which there is compassion shown more for the mugger than for the mugged, more for the one who does the violence than for the victim. This is a kind of restraint which is not commendable and which I fear is bringing some trouble to our nation.
Well, if you translate that into international terms, might it be argued that much too much international restraint is being shown towards those nations in the world which live by aggression and which preach a hatred and whose evil deeds might have been aborted, or whose careers might have been aborted a generation ago by the use of strategic power?
You probably mean Russia, huh?
Yeah.
No, I think that restraint is here commendable because I am afraid that any show of force would have brought retaliation, and it could very conceivably be the last war.
But what when they were not in a position to retaliate effectively? I'm asking a very serious question, namely, is it a part of the Christian obligation in international terms to exert oneself when one can do so without bringing on apocalypse? If it is predictable to reasonable men of active conscience that to do so at that moment will be to spare the world an ordeal tomorrow. For instance, a preemptive strike against Hitler in 1938 is now something that almost everybody wishes we had done, including you?
Yes.
Why then not say a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union in 1949?
Well, now we're taking back the mentality of 1970 to 1949. And when we go back to that mentality, Russia was considered a democracy. Russia was considered on our side. I can remember once giving a lecture in Youngstown, Ohio, on the fact that Russia was going to take over Eastern Europe. And some very high important person said, "How dare you say that? This day is past. We live in a democracy." And in the 1949, that's what we were thinking about.
I think Archbishop Sheen, that you're a little bit, a few years off, aren't you? Fulton,
yes,
Missouri.
36,
Fulton,
right.
Missouri was 46 when the Cold War was declared.
Right.
And even the Democratic president had recognized it by 1949, indeed rather dramatically, with the Truman Doctrine and so on. So whereas I think it is true that the illusions you identify were widely shared in 1945, 44, 45, or 6, by 1949, the animosity of Stalin was pretty plain spoken.
Yes, but I cannot look back and feel that we should have resorted to violence in those days. I think we would have brought a greater apocalypse upon the world.
But you can, as regards 1938?
Yes, hypothetically, 1938.
Bishop Sheen, in your indictments of the American role in Vietnam, you have used the figure that it, in fact, is costing us something in the neighborhood of $1 million per death. Now, that has had the effect on most people of saying, what an unspeakable war. It has exactly the opposite reaction on me, because it seems to me that since everyone would agree that we have it within our power to kill people much more cheaply and don't, it does suggest that we are going out of our way to keep from killing people. If we are spending $1 million per death of a single enemy, then doesn't this suggest that the discriminatory apparatus that we are using is highly tuned? And isn't that a mark of civilization?
First of all, what I said that it was costing $1 million a day. If there were 24 men, $1 million an hour. If there were 24 men killed in a day, then it would be $1 million a day. That was the statistic.
Which is not far off.
Yes.
Actually, it's probably, it's in the neighborhood of 250, 300 people a week.
Now, how are you going to turn that?
Well, what I'm saying is, if we wanted to kill more people, we could do so much more cheaply by Dresden-type bombings. Our reluctance to do so, or failure to do so, it seems to me in terms of moral arithmetic, is praiseworthy. And under the circumstances, I have never understood the use of the high ratio of dollars per death as an argument pointing to the immorality of the war, but to the contrary.
Yes. It was not so much to point just to the immorality of this war, but rather to the immorality of war itself. What I was doing was to go back to figures that had been gathered by some historian about how much it cost to kill a man in different wars. For example, it is estimated that it cost Julius Caesar 75 cents a man. In World War I, it cost something like 20,000. In World War II, it cost 200,000. Then I adduced the figure that it cost $1 million an hour in Vietnam. I was not speaking about moral arithmetic. I was just speaking about the terrific economic burden that is thrust upon mankind in virtue of fighting. So I would not, you're very clever, however, to draw that conclusion that it was an evidence of our restraint, and I can see the value in the deduction, but that was not my purpose.
But your purpose surely isn't to illegitimize war, is it? That is to say, do you not believe that some wars are defensible? In fact, some wars are imperative?
Yes, I could see a reason for a defensive war.
Yeah.
If we were invaded.
Well, then, therefore, it becomes a strategic question whether a particular war is a defensive war, correct?
Yes.
I mean, it becomes a theoretical question whether or not Vietnam does relate to the defense of this. Right. And that, therefore, you would not criticize as a class those people who defend the Vietnam War.
I certainly would not.
However, you happen yourself to feel that the time is past when you would choose to defend it.
Yes. And the statement that I made about it, Mr. Buckley, was about 3 years ago, when the statement was much more applicable than it is today. And furthermore, I was giving a Christian appraisal, not a political appraisal. And I was then speaking of what I had spoken of before, namely about the value of restraint. That I felt that if we gave up in Vietnam, we would have given a moral example to the world, and perhaps would have won the moral opinion of the world. 3 years later, it's impossible to do it. But we are withdrawing, and we're withdrawing to now at a time when it makes it possible for the world to conclude that we've lost our first war.